Okay, so today I will be doing geography. So the topic that I'm concentrating on is river systems. So as all of you can see that we are dealing with systems. So a system is something that is made up of more than two things. For an example, when you look at your sound system, it is made up of an amp, speakers, and a lot of stuff. So that's why they call it a sound system, the system. So here we'll be dealing with a system of rivers. So we'll be dealing with a river and all other aspects that are found in a river. So when we deal with a river, we'll be focusing on water, because of water is something that makes a river. So the first thing we have to know, where does the water that is found on rivers comes from? So that water, it comes from precipitation and groundwater. Okay? So the first thing we'll be dealing with the water that comes from precipitation. So the water that comes from precipitation, we call it surface runoff. So we'll be dealing with surface runoff. Sometimes they call it direct flow. And then secondly, as I've just said, that another water, it comes from groundwater. Sometimes they call it a base flow. So surface runoff is the water that comes from precipitation, and then after it reaches the surface of the earth, it starts to flow on the surface. So precipitation, it can be in the form of rain, snow, or hail. So the surface runoff is, is the water that comes from precipitation. So precipitation can be in a form of rain or snow or hail. So this water, when it reaches the surface of the earth, it starts to flow. For example, when you see the water after it has rained, so that water that you see on the street flowing on the surface, we call it surface runoff. And then another thing is groundwater. Groundwater is the water that is found underground. So this water, it becomes stored underground after precipitation. After this water that flows on the surface of the rain has infiltrated into the surface, and then after that it becomes stored underground. So when it is underground, we call it groundwater. So after this water has been stored underground, later on it will come out of the ground and then flow into rivers. Then once it gets into rivers, it forms a river system. So the groundwater is the water that is stored underground. So now we have been dealing with where does the water found in the rivers comes from. So as I've said, it comes from surface runoff, and then it also comes from groundwater. So now we will be dealing with the factors that influence a runoff, this surface runoff, or this surface runoff, it is influenced by what? What exactly is driving this surface runoff? So we'll be dealing with several factors that influence this surface runoff. So the first thing that influences surface runoff is precipitation, like I've already said. Another factor is gradient. Another one is permeability. And then another one is porosity. And then another one is vegetation. So these are the factors that influence the runoff. These are the factors that causes the water to flow on the surface of the earth. So the first one is precipitation. So how does precipitation influence runoff? So when it is raining, when there's rain, the water from rain is going to reach the surface. When it reaches the surface, it causes surface runoff. So when there's too much rainfall, like a lot of rain, obviously there will be a lot of water in the surface of the earth because of the rain is heavy. So too much precipitation increases the number of surface streams. Surface streams are those little rivers that are flowing on the surface. So when there's too much precipitation or too much rainfall, these streams are going to increase in number. And when they increase in number, obviously the surface runoff will also increase. And then when there's little precipitation, the opposite of this thing is going to occur. When there's a little precipitation, obviously there will be little rainfall. When there's little rainfall, we will have small amount of these surface streams on the ground. Therefore, the surface runoff will also decrease. And then another thing is gradient of the slope. When we talk about the gradient of the slope, we are looking at how level or steep the surface is. That's when we are talking about the gradient. So obviously, if the surface is too steep, there's a lot of water that's going to flow. Maybe when the when the surface is like this, the slope of the surface is like this, and then we have this steep slope. Obviously, when we have when we have water, the water is going to flow downward. But then if our gradient is gentle like this, there's going to be a lot of water on the top of the surface because of the slope is not steep, it's gentle. So if we have steep gradient, when we have steep gradient or steep slope, there will be more water flowing. So when there's too much water flowing on the ground, obviously the surface runoff is going to increase. And then when we have a gentle slope, there will be few streams that are able to flow on the ground. The water is going to be stagnant. And if the water is stagnant, it's going to infiltrate or is going to get into the ground faster, therefore decreasing surface runoff. And then another factor is permeability. So when we talk about permeability, we are focusing on the type of rock that underlies that particular area. Some areas are lined by rocks that have cracks. Some of them may have joints. So if these rocks have too much cracks on them, obviously when the water flows on top of that particular rock, it's going to infiltrate into those cracks or those joints. And then when the water infiltrates, obviously we'll have less water on the surface. And then when we have few streams or a little water on the surface, obviously the surface runoff is going to decrease because there is no surface streams on the ground. So rocks that have cracks or joints increase infiltration. So infiltration, like I've said, is the process whereby water gets into the ground, like it uses those little cracks or pores that are found on the ground to go underground. So that process is known as infiltration. So when the rocks have cracks or joints, therefore infiltration is going to increase. A lot of water is going to flow underground, whereby decreasing surface streams. So when we have little surface streams, obviously surface runoff is going to decrease. And when we go to porosity, when we look to porosity, we'll be focusing on those little pores or those little openings that are found on the ground and then on the rocks that are underground. So if the ground has a lot of pores or little openings, obviously the water is going to infiltrate, just like that thing that you use to make a coffee, a filter that you use to make a coffee, maybe this other type of coffee, I forgot its name. So when you use that filter, it's going to filter whatever that we'll be using to make that coffee, so that you can have only clean coffee on your cup. So the same thing applies to porosity of the ground or of the underlying rock. So if that rock has too much pores, it's going to allow more water to flow into it. And then when there's too much water going underground, the surface runoff is going to decrease because there are no surface streams that are going to be left. So another factor I'll be focusing on is vegetation. So I'm going to try to do it here. So when we talk about vegetation, we'll be focusing on the plants that are found on the surface. So if the vegetation is dense, or if plants are closer together, they are dense, obviously they are going to cause more infiltration to occur, because of their roots are going to absorb too much water that is flowing on the ground. So when those roots absorb that water so that they can utilize it, they will decrease it on the surface of the ground. And when there is little water on the ground, obviously the surface runoff will also decrease. But then if the vegetation are sparse, or they are far apart from each other, then there won't be too much infiltration, because we won't have too much roots to absorb that water so that they can utilize it. So we will be having too much water flowing on the ground. So dense vegetation increases surface runoff due to increased